Hello, and welcome to another Bevington Group vignette. Now, the purpose of a vignette is to give you a short form video on an important issue of the day. And this one will be on responding to extreme volatility. And there's a particular way we'll approach this, which we think you'll find useful, giving you some frameworks. But before I get started in earnest, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands from which I'm presenting. They are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. All right, let's get started. Responding to extreme volatility. We're going to talk about the context a little bit. Why is it volatile? What do we mean by that? We're going to talk about adaptability and anti-fragility. And then we're going to talk about responding in the middle of volatility. And I'm going to link in productivity and adaptability and show that they're not such strange bedfellows as might initially be thought. Okay, but let's get stuck in. So most of you will have heard of VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. You know it's still happening. Just today, for example, there are trade actions in a US court delaying Donald Trump's trade program potentially. There is Elon Musk leaving Dodge. So lots and lots of things going on at any given point in time, leading to volatility in markets. Now, it's been volatility upwards of late, which I'm sure is very comforting to people, but that doesn't mean that the underlying economy is necessarily stable. And in fact, it's not. If we look actually at the current economic context, these are numbers from the ABS. This blue line shows the year-on-year profitability of Australian companies, all sorts, shapes and sizes from the ABS. And you'll see that it's been consistently negative for the last few years. And in fact, there you can see actually from the midpoint between 22 and 23, it has been somewhat suppressed. So this is in a world where, of course, there has been extreme volatility. They have been coming off COVID. But one of the things that actually makes the market all the more challenging for many organizations that are trying to lift that profit performance or trying to manage, if you're a public sector organization or a service organization with tighter budgets, is the reduced productivity. So these are the productivity numbers. We had a really fantastic boost during the Hawke-Keating era when a great deal of reform was done. We haven't done fabulously since then, and productivity is actually in decline. And in fact, the year-on-year numbers in the productivity bulletin from the Australian Productivity Commission seem to have a negative in front of it once again. So productivity is important. Why? It does mean that in effect, we're not producing as much as we should or could per unit of cost. This is particularly unit of labor cost that actually over time reduces the quality of living for Australians. It is somewhat reflected of inflationary pressures, but they are mitigating. This is just straight underlying productivity. So where are we? So we're in a world where strange and unusual things happen on the global stage. Locally, we've got actually suppressed private sector profits, and we've got reduced productivity. Now, all of those have actually the potential to lean into or create problems of unexpected risk. And I'll come to that in a few minutes' time. So, and to help understand that, adaptability and anti-fragility are two concepts we need to introduce. So, when we talk about risk, we tend to talk at Bevington about risk intelligence. Risk intelligence is more than risk management. Risk management is a subdiscipline. Risk management is where you would say, hey, I've got a risk. Here's its probability. Here's a mitigating action. Here's my residual probability. Here's the potential impact. For organizations as a whole, when thinking about the environment they're in, they're thinking about risk, but they're thinking about all sorts of unexpected things. They're thinking about that which they can't predict. In which case, what they're really interested in is surviving events which they can predict and that they fail to predict. So that means resilience. So the theories that we're going to talk about are a little bit to do with organizational resilience. Now, what really happens is organizations need to fortify the organization to buy time to adapt. That is, fundamental to at least some forms of resilience theory. So they might have traditional risk planning. So a BCP, if something goes wrong, a business continuity plan. They've got systems to sense and respond what's going on so they can respond faster than everybody else, get the critical equipment they need in the case of a climate or weather event, for example, before anyone else does. They've got the financial reserves to take a hit. They've got the non-financial reserves, which include people who can be allocated onto a problem at short notice, and they've got fire breaks, meaning they can make sure that a problem in one part of the organization does not infect other parts of the organization. All of those buys you time to adapt. So adaptation is a critical skill when times are volatile. Because it may be that you're having to shift multiple times in a relatively short space of time. Now, there are two types of adaptation that we think about. There's short-term, sort of rolling with the punches, dodging the blow, if you like, and attempting to just hustle your way through a short-term problem. And then there's transformative adaptation, where you think things are actually in a longer term going to be much more difficult. So, for example, in the short term, you might cope with bushfires or you might cope with floods. These are things that are very relevant right now, floods happening in northern New South Wales. In the longer term, you're not just managing for this month, this week, next month. What you're actually doing, for example, is potentially managing your infrastructure for a world where those events happen more often. That is very much that transformational as opposed to tactical adaptation. You need time. You actually need time and space to be able to do both. So how? You've got an agile organizational structure. Well, that will help. You can bring teams together at short notice, and they're used to coming together in short notice to work in multidisciplinary teams to solve problems. Great. You can sense quickly. So you've got systems that actually pick up earlier than anybody else can do what's about to go wrong, and therefore you can do something. You can scale and swarm. This is the idea. You can put available resources, because you've got a flexible structure, onto a problem and basically slow down solutioning on things that matter less. So you might take people from one project and put them onto a project that deals with an immediate problem, and they scale and then swarm around that problem. That's what that means. Mission-directed leadership, allowing local leadership to make decisions that matter in that locality under conditions that might be very different from the conditions in head office. So you might have floods in northern New South Wales, and it's perfectly dry in Melbourne. And if you're head officed in Melbourne, you wouldn't be picking it up. Debureaucratization. Bureaucracy slows down decision-making. Slow decision-making is often not the right plan. And strategy one, strategy two, often called barbell thinking, I'm going to explain in a few minutes' time. So if you need time to adapt, one of the fabulous positions to be in was to be in a position where you can actually adapt very quickly. Because if you can adapt very quickly, your resources are far from exhausted by the time you're actually in a position to cope with the new reality. Now, adaptation and anti-fragility are very, very closely related. And anti-fragility is an idea from Taleb, and Taleb's idea was anti-fragile is when your organization gets stronger as a result of the stresses that it's put under, because that organization will adapt. The muscle will strengthen. So what gets in the way of that? What gets in the way of really good adaptation? What gets in the way of resilience or anti-fragility? Well, hidden vulnerabilities would be one. So places where you're weak, you might break. You don't know how, but you might break. For example, you have only one product in only one market. That would be a fragility. Inability to adapt. You basically have very labyrinthian and bureaucratic decision-making processes, or decision-making can only be made by one person, but it's a very large organization. There's a queue of decisions out the door. That's an inability to adapt. A black swan risk. This can happen to any of us. Black swan events. Something basically that you did not predict, and it was not on your business continuity plan or your risk register. It happened, and now you have to cope. And there's been no pre-thinking as to what to do. And overconfidence. Overconfidence is terribly dangerous. Humility, to know that there are things that you might not predict because you're in a VUCA world, and that there are problems that might be challenging for you to resolve by yourself, and you might need a team. Very important. Generally, Taleb's view would be, and this is a massive oversimplification, that some systems might be particularly fragile if they're very large, they're particularly complex, or highly concentrated. Now, there's actually a lot of nuance around that, but take that as a simplification. But if you're not thinking about resilience, you might not see risks, you might adapt poorly, you might basically be shaken to the core by unpredictable high impact events, and you might continue even from them to underestimate the uncertainty that you face. What can you do? Well, there are a number of sensible approaches to strengthening yourself now if you believe that the world will continue to remain as volatile as it is. Now, I would argue that there's no evidence that would indicate that the world necessarily will settle down. And there's plenty of evidence that indicating that volatility is likely to continue. So doing something about adaptation is a great idea. Here are some things you can practically think about. In any context or situation, including product, process, structure, leave yourself some options. Leave yourself the ability to flex in the event of an unknown event. Skin in the game. It's a good idea for your leaders to have skin in the game and for your partners to have skin in the game so you're all on the same page. Barbell strategy. When you are thinking about what you do to your organization in your strategic planning and your quarterly reviews, think about a barbell. Left-hand side of a barbell, think of this as the pieces of work that you do to improve the organization as is. The right-hand side of the barbell are the pieces of work you do that might fundamentally change your organization. The experiments you run on the right-hand side might actually never come to fruition, but the fact that you're regularly experimenting actually builds an adaptation muscle and potentially provides you an out for a future risk that is very unique to you and your organization. So a barbell strategy. Decentralization with some caveats. So don't go just implementing it off this implementation or off this presentation, but decentralization does have an advantage. It can allow local decision-making if done properly. Redundancy, give yourself some slack. So you might actually have people very busy on project A, but they might need to stop that for the moment to create slack to move to project B. Always having people you can move from one initiative to another is a good idea when you're trying to address a volatile world. And via negativa, by removing things. So we often have too much complexity, too much risk, too many actions, too many things we're doing. Removing them actually reduces fragilities. So what's another way to think about this? Well, you can think about actually building some resilience into your sourcing. Perhaps having offshored supply chains without redundancies does make you more fragile. Perhaps you should have some alternatives. Perhaps organizations that make faster decisions as long as they are done rigorously actually can do much, much better. They might have some rules of thumb that do much better as well. Financial structure, make sure that everything's not tied financially to your weakest link. Make sure that you've got good sources of information, particularly sense and respond, finding things early, and have a functional design that's lean. Make sure that you don't have structures that get in the way of good decision-making because they're inherently bureaucratic. And one way to think about this, if, for example, you're in a divisionalized structure, is to think about what is it at the divisional level that they need to be able to decide, and can we actually get, to some extent, head office out of the way of the day-to-day decisions and get them focused on the strategic investment decisions where head office is best placed, demonstrating its intelligence. Now, there are frameworks around that summarize all this thinking in a pretty neat way. One of them is from an Australian academic, Anthea Roberts, and she's got a triple R approach. She thinks about risk, reward, and resilience frameworks. And if you look at resilience down the bottom, it gives you clues as to how to think about that are very consistent with the sort of work we've just been talking about. The ability to absorb the change. So this is that fortification that we talked about before adaptation. And here are the two parts of adaptation: short-term adaptation and then transformative adaptation as you move to the new reality. Now, in fact, Anthea has a piece of software called Dragonfly. That is actually AI, and it helps you think through the risks. Anthea and her team have this Dragonfly software. Now, it is crucial to recognize that you can't predict everything. What we're talking about is actually reducing fragilities. The great thing about reducing fragilities is you might not need to guess the risk. You just know that you might break there. So if you are focused on one product, if you've fragile supply chains, if you're dependent on one supplier, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, if you cannot free up resources to allocate to an unexpected problem, then you have fragilities. And what you're really doing is addressing the fragilities, as well as, don't stop thinking about it, addressing your risks. To the extent that you can do so, you'll be becoming more risk intelligent, which effectively is thinking strategically about your risks, which means, yes, risk management's part of that, but it's not the only piece. It's actually about choosing to build your capabilities so you're less fragile. So move into an anti-fragile direction, do consider the following. Recognize the difference between certainty, risk, and uncertainty. You can't predict everything. Many things that are coming our way are uncertain and inherently unpredictable, which means you should be just as focused on where you're fragile, not just on a specific risk. And part of that's accepting that you won't actually have the information you need to be able to predict everything. If you actually step your way through, another thing to think about is how you actually make decisions, making sure that you're making decisions in a smart way, yes, but don't burden your decision-making with unnecessary bureaucracy. Be aware that your decision-making culture has an enormous impact on your adaptation. And you might actually focus on a learning culture to improve your risk decision-making. Now, before we absolutely finish, I do want to try to address one issue that comes up a lot for us because we tend to work a great deal in the productivity space, which is it true that by being productive, you are potentially making yourself fragile? This is not true. And I'll go to try to explain this in a few minutes' time. So these are the sort of essentially techniques, strategies that are mostly deployed. There are others, but are mostly deployed to deal with efficiency. So in a world where productivity is declining, we expect organizations, all other things being equal, to try to do something about this. At the moment, we're not having a great impact on this, but perhaps with AI and automation, we will. I'll come to that in a few minutes' time. So you might improve your process efficiencies, you might improve your capabilities, which isn't just skills, it's also systems that might inherently be more productive. More is produced for a particular unit of input. You might want to remove manual effort, which, by the way, carries a huge amount of risk with it, potentially, and replace that with automation effort when it's appropriate. You might want to introduce flexibility. You can see why flexibility is important from an adaptation perspective, but flexibility actually is also really important from a productivity perspective. So if you can flexibly change, for example, a production line, if I go to the old-fashioned literature on this, in what's called a single-minute exchange of die, if you understand lean, but basically shift what you are making quickly, relative to your competitor, you might be considerably more efficient. In effective structures, basically you've got structures that get in the way of information flows. A lot of what's a good structure these days is about creating great implementation and information flows. And there are good ones and bad ones. And of course, you've got legacy technology. Well, let's take process inefficiencies and efficiencies as an example. Now, many people think that the whole idea of a process efficiency is to remove the fat. That is incorrect. It's to remove the waste. So there will be some redundancy where it's appropriately deployed, let's say in a project to make things better, a little bit of spare capacity is not inefficient. And in fact, the lean methodologies, which talk about process efficiency, always encourage you to have a little bit spare, maybe have it deployed onto projects whereby you can make things better, but it can be immediately freed up in the event of an emergency. One way to create that capacity is, of course, to process re-engineer. So you improve your processes, you save some money, and you bank some of it into your operations doing more improvement work. You create a virtuous cycle, but by doing the improvement work, you also create a bank of people, bank of resources who have become incredibly good at problem solving. So to build your own process re-engineering team effectively improves productivity, reduces cost, and gives you a set of people with skills that can be used to help you adapt in the event of a crisis. So if you look at what is commonly called upon from a process perspective as benefits for improving productivity through process, they're also extremely valuable from an adaptation perspective. Efficiency is not a bad thing as long as you've got some contingent resources, that's some of that spare capacity. It can enhance customer experience. Happier customers tend to be more sticky, including in an emergency. That's very resilient. That's a resilient thing. Technology implementation risks, to the extent that clean processes reduce in implementation risks, that reducing fragility. And reduce technology implementation costs, well, then you've got more reserves in place to be able to cope with a crisis. Automation, same. Automation, if it's implemented well with some good process work, will give you many of the same benefits, including reduced costs, some of which can be reinvested into a capacity for further improvement. And that capacity for further improvement is also a capacity that helps you adapt. And we do note that AI is now mixing with robotic process automation. They're two very important technologies which give an exceptionally high return on investment and will allow you over time to automate many parts of a process. So there are a few extra slides in this for when we post it that you might find interesting to read, but I will just finish by saying the following. We are in a VUCA world. We don't see any particular reason why that should stop. It's very useful in this world to understand some of the science and philosophy of adaptation, anti-fragility, and some of the frameworks that are around, like the Tripperoff framework, that help you actually balance risk, reward, and resilience. And there's no conflict between well-done productivity work, particularly where you are building a capacity to do ongoing productivity work, and adaptation, because the skills that allow you to solve problems to improve your productivity, when you build that productivity capacity, will also allow you to adapt in future. And it can create a buffer, can create a reserve, which can be redeployed in the event of an emergency. I hope you've enjoyed this vignette. This is Roger Perry, signing out.